less than stellar, the first day of May, so it is May Day, right?
Yep.
It is May Day, it is gonna get better, even though it feels like it could be the first day of November. But thank you, it's so good to have you all here, and we're really fortunate to have Lou Mamoletti, who is our general manager of our water department, is back with us, because the last time that he was here, the poor guy had a water break that he was trying to manage as well, and he had a little bit more information that he wanted to share.
I should do the same thing.
Are you trying to turn?
Musical chairs.
Musical chairs.
Oh, you want to do
So,
why not?
next month,
Doesn't affect your seat.
Next month, we're going to have Reverend Boylan with us from the Byfield Parish, who will have, some information, again, another historical program, because he's such a wonderful local historian. We always come away with good information. But before I turn it over to Lou, and then
Sure.
I have a brief announcement. One of us at the table has been selected as the local preservationist, to receive the local preservationist award from the Mass Historical Commission in later this month. So that would be Mr. Desjardins, who is well deserving. So the local historical commission had nominated Ed for this award, and they referred to 46 years of service and historical preservation. I think between the two, between Raleigh and Georgetown, and you certainly provided the lead on a lot of projects that just.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Very, very, so that Ed will go into Boston for an award and be honored at the State House, and I think that's fabulous.
Good.
We'll want pictures.
Wonderful.
Maybe you'll autograph something for us. No, it's well deserved.
check.
Yeah. So.
A lot of other people involved, you don't
Yeah.
realize
Oh, yeah.
what the historical commission and
Yes.
historical societies
Yeah.
are involved in.
Anybody know that?
She's from
So,
Maine.
I know, he's from, and that's why he likes those blueberry pancakes. Yeah. Yeah, no, well deserved. So, thank you very much for. Yes.
So what's the secret?
I was nominated as an unsung heroine of the state. So, there's a ceremony in Boston that I was invited to later this month. Of course, it's the day before our oldest daughter, we're expecting our second granddaughter, which is probably the biggest news. So whether or not I'll go into Boston, I might be in Boston, but I might be at the hospital. So, but it was, yeah, no, it was, because again, it certainly isn't just my work.
Two famous people in one room.
I'm very, very fortunate to have wonderful people with us. When we had our volunteer breakfast this week, that was really apparent to me again. But the work that others do. So we're going to turn right over to Lou, and so I'll see you. June 5th we'll have our Father's Day men's breakfast with Reverend Hill, and then we'll take July off, but we'll be back in August. Simply because some of us will be in Maine.
The rain in Spain
Yeah.
does not necessarily remain.
So thank you, Lou. Thank you again. And I'm going to just take some plates.
Turn on the water.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming back. Thanks for a great breakfast. You guys are pretty lucky. I saw a lot of hard work back there, so but I'm sure you guys all very much appreciate it.
They probably don't want to know what was happening back there.
That's where the magic happens, as they say. So,
I'll come back.
if you recall, I was here a few months back and we had a chance to talk about the water system. I think what I had kind of focused on there was sort of the history of water systems and kind of the general concepts of how a water system is put together. We ran out of time. Obviously there was a number of additional things I wanted to talk about if you would have me back, and fortunate enough that you did. So what I'd like to talk to you more about today is more about Georgetown's water system. I know there are a number of you here that have lived here for quite some time, so some of you have probably lived through the various iterations of the water system and how it has been developed over time. originally, the water system in town was created in the 30s. I believe it's 1934 was the start of the first construction. And what that entailed was developing a municipal well along the Parker River in the areas off of West Street. And from there, they ran a transmission water main up West Street to turn on to Andover, to turn on to Ballpate, and eventually to hook up to the water storage tank. That's the kind of silver metallic elevated tank that you see if you're driving in from Boxford on 133. You can see it just over the tree line near the golf course. It's painted Georgetown on the side. So that was the original tank, and then the water main was extended down to the center of town, and water mains were built generally in the center of town, a little bit on Central Street, Library Street, East and West Main Street, the streets that wrap around the library, Pleasant Street, Lincoln Street, in that area. And that essentially was extended over the next few years, out, say every couple of years it would go, another 1,000 feet here, another 1,000 feet there. And essentially it was the beginnings of the development of the water system that we know in the downtown. With time, more areas were added. We have a whole list of what streets were added and what dates, and it's actually very interesting to look at, because I can sort of picture it in my head as I'm reading down the list, how the construction would have went, and it was very much similar to how the town developed, kind of as a whole in terms of the overall development and the construction of houses and neighborhoods. So along the way, obviously, as there were more people in town, there was a need for more water, so additional wells were developed. The one big problem relative to sources of water in Georgetown is that they all generally lie in the same place. They're all generally pulling from the same aquifer. So if the water quality is poor in one well, it's likely that it's poor in similar fashion to the other wells. If the water quality is adequate in one of the wells, it's likely that it'll be adequate in adjacent wells. If you put the wells too close together, you're competing in between the wells, so you need to space them apart a little bit. So there's a kind of a lot that goes into the development of a source water strategy, so that there's ample water and of good quality to deliver to the community. And as I've heard a number of you say, historically the water quality had always been good. Just like historically the traffic on Route 1 through Saugus and Linfield was great in the 40s and 50s, until everybody had a car, and then 2 cars, and then 3 cars, and then people started driving into Boston to go to work, and suddenly the infrastructure couldn't keep pace with the demand on the infrastructure. In much the same way, that's what's happened to the water system in Georgetown. Now that's really not the end of the story, because if it were, then we wouldn't have a water treatment plant, we wouldn't have additional storage tanks. A lot of things have progressed along the way in response to the increase in the demand. Now, I'm sure it's debatable as to whether or not the increases and the results that have happened from those increases have given the results that we want. And clearly we know that there are areas in town that still have inadequate water quality. I've been on board here since September. We're actually in the process of implementing a lot of new projects that are intended to help improve the water quality. And I'll get into some of those. In general, the things that have been done in the past, a lot of them were, in terms of infrastructure, were done in response to the development of new subdivisions and growth in the town. And as a civil engineer, most of the projects that I've worked on in my career, the challenge is always how to respond to have adequate infrastructure where there's been demands placed on the systems prior to those improvements being made. You would like to think that you'd always plan for something, but you never plan to replace the roof, or you never plan to replace your septic system. One day those things fail, and you're left with trying to react to them, and maybe you tolerate their poor performance for a while because you don't have all the money set aside, or you don't have a plan to replace it right away. And infrastructure kind of works the same way. We deal with the public all the time, and so making the public understand the challenges that we have can sometimes be difficult. Now, maybe that's in the past. Historically, government hasn't always delivered on the promise, and so it's up to the people to kind of hold the government accountable for those things. For municipal infrastructure and public utilities, it's much the same way. I can speak for myself, knowing that the projects that I've been involved with in the past, there's always been a need for improvements. The question is the funding there? Is the will of the people there? Is there enough consensus developed that people want to fix the problem? Here in Georgetown, we have much of the same issues and concerns. I live on Marlborough Road. I've lived there since 1995. When we moved there in 1995, the dishwasher used to turn orange. Bathtubs would turn orange. In 2000, we built, the water department built a treatment plant that removes iron and manganese, and did a remarkable job. In fact, it was noticeable within 3 or 4 months that something had dramatically changed. And because I'm in the business, I knew what was changing, and I knew the results that I would see. Today, my water is still excellent. I'm in a neighborhood where the water system is looped properly. There's a constant movement of water, and I'm kind of in the middle of the system. So the improvements that were made in 2000 worked for me. There are places in town where the improvements made in 2000 didn't work for folks. And so we've kind of been working our way through some very small measures along the way to try to improve that. That really hasn't happened. Certainly not to the satisfaction of many of the folks that live in the outer lying areas where a lot of the dead ends are. So I think there's a change in philosophy right now amongst the Board of Water Commissioners, that water quality improvements need to be made at those extreme areas and system-wide to help make some improvements. And that the idea of saying, well, we've tried everything and there's nothing we can do, that isn't good enough. There are obviously enough folks in town that really want to see things happen. Enough folks in town wanted a new school. There's a new school. When I moved here in 1995, there were some people that wanted a new school, and it never happened because there wasn't enough people and enough momentum to make a change. I think there's a lot more momentum now to make some changes in the town's water system. And I think there's good vision and leadership from the Board of Water Commissioners. And I'd like to think that I'm going to be part of that, or I'm starting to become part of that. The water system, I don't want to bore you with a whole bunch here, but generally the water system, I'll try to stand on this side. Generally the water system, all the water starts over here on the western side of town. And the system basically was developed with a tank near the golf course and a water main down Andover Street, and water mains feeding sort of the downtown, the smaller sized lots, more denser development. So if you just try to picture this as the water system, you'd say, okay, well, looks like you've got it covered, and when you start to expand the water system this way and this way, then what you've created hydraulically and chemically in the water are a lot of challenges that, you know, probably aren't going to be completely handled by the way the original system was developed. You know, it's like you can only put so much added on to the end before you realize that you're too far away. It's like trying to bring electricity too far away. At some point, the infrastructure really doesn't handle it, and what you deliver to the farthest end really isn't sufficient for where it starts. Again, water is much the same way. So what we're trying to work on now are improvements that are gonna help that. The water gets delivered hydraulically into the system, I would say sufficiently. For most areas, the water pressure is good. There are a few areas where the water pressure is lower, but in a water system, typically you would provide booster pumping in those localized areas to help improve that. And that's relatively straightforward. The town has done some of that, and I would say in general, you know, water pressure is not a real big issue. Water, a sufficient amount of water, you know, to meet the capacity and the demand, and then have that water be of adequate and appropriate quality, something that people believe is acceptable. That's a different challenge entirely. And oddly enough, the quality of the water and the quantity that you treat and deliver are directly related. The more we pump, the deeper we have to go into the sources of the wells, the more contaminants we pull into the water, the more of a burden it is on the treatment plant, the tougher and the challenge it is for us to deliver it appropriately. So again, these are all things that we're working on right now. We developed a report. This was started by the Board of Water Commissioners before I got here, with an engineering firm, AECom. They're actually a very big company, but the folks that we're dealing with are part of a local office from a smaller engineering firm that they had acquired some number of years ago. The smaller firm was known as Metcalf and Eddy. In our industry, Metcalf and Eddy is regarded as really some of the pioneers in the civil engineering world, especially in the municipal water and wastewater fields. So in terms of do we have the right people involved to help us give us answers, I would say the answer is yes. So I feel very comfortable that you know, we have a good plan of attack. The plan of attack actually you know, looks something like this. And I realize you won't be able to read the numbers here, but if you can just generally see what's listed there, you've got green at the top, kind of like a pale blue in the middle, and like a pale purple color at the bottom. So as you can see, there's about 7 or 8, I think it's 7 items in the green. There's 4 more in the light blue, and 3 in the light purple. So what that basically is it's a recommendations table with costs and sort of an implementation schedule. The green is the early phase. We're referring to those as short-term recommendations. So basically we have short-term, medium-term, and longer-term recommendations that have been made to the town. So as of right now, we basically either have implemented or are in the process of implementing during the calendar year of 2014, all 7 of the recommendations. So as you can tell, clearly, the board followed through, developed a plan, and is now following through with the implementation of that plan. So I'll tell you some basic things about what the plan involves. And just kind of read them through here. The first one is disconnecting the elevated tank that I spoke of, the one that you see on the way in to the town. The town's storage tanks basically consist of 3 tanks. The first one is that elevated tank. It holds about 300,000 gallons of water. And again, that was built in the 30s, 1934, I believe. And then there are 2 more tanks. They're concrete water storage tanks. They each hold 600,000 gallons, and those are located up behind Baldpate Hospital. The way those tanks are piped, they act basically as one tank, even though it's 2 physical separate tanks. They're piped together so that they act together. So the idea of shutting off the smaller of the 2 tanks, or the smaller of the 3 tanks, and leaving the other 2 in place really doesn't create a problem in terms of adequate storage in the system. There's more than enough water stored. The problem hydraulically is that the water level in the elevated tank basically controls turning on and off the wells where we get the water that comes through the treatment plant. So it's kind of like a sump pump. When the level gets to a certain spot, a pump kicks on and gets rid of the water. Here, when the level of water in the tank is too low, the switch kicks on and tells the pumps, hey, I need more water. So in the process of operating the system, what appears to have been happening is that the water would stay resident in the concrete tanks for excessively long amounts of time. And mostly the movement of water in and out of storage was only happening predominantly at the smaller elevated tank. There's a concept in water distribution and storage called water age. And just as if you were to pour a glass of water on the table and come back in 3 months, I think you'd notice that there's something different about this water. It's not the same as if it just came out of the faucet. There's a stagnancy to it that's just different. You know, whether that's the oxygen driving out of the water or things settling in the water. It's just not, it's not desirable in a water system. And so that's really what the driver was to shut this tank off, is that we have evidence that says that the water stays in the other 2 tanks far too long. And if you have old water or aging water in your water system, that's going to deteriorate the water quality overall. So that was the first recommendation. That was an easy one. Basically, you shut the valve, empty the tank, and and continue operating the system. And we did that. That was back in October. Every one of these recommendations, is going to have some incremental effect, and it would be nice to know which of these changes made the immediate improvement. But I don't think we're necessarily looking for the silver bullet here. I think we're looking for a strategy that involves a number of things that we know in and of themselves are going to make improvements, so that there's some synergy there and some cumulative benefit that that all of the recommendations that we follow through on are going to help. The flushing program is another one where we are trying to move the water in a single direction. Basically, take clean water and move it through the system and force the dirty water out of the extremities of the system. And that's part of what we're doing now. And if knowing the layout of the town, if you understand that we started near the tank and near the treatment plant, we worked our way through the downtown, we worked our way south down Central Street, we worked on our way east along East Main Street and into over near the highway. Then we'll work our way north, as we've started now, working our way up North Street. So clearly we're trying to work the water unidirectionally away from the sources. And that's something that the staff is actively working on even right now. So that's going to help scour out any debris that's in the pipe and hopefully help to improve the water quality there. Some of the other changes are more related to the treatment plant and the tanks, and they're more treatment based. We use potassium hydroxide to raise the pH of the water. prior to the treatment process. The treatment process is a filtration, a pressure filtration vessel that uses a media called green sand, and it removes iron and manganese out of the water. We use another chemical called potassium permanganate. And then the last chemical that we use is sodium hypochlorite. It's a disinfectant, and that's what helps eliminate any bacteria in the water, things that won't be removed through the current filtration system, and help to maintain a chlorine residual in the water out into the system, so that if there's any bacteria along the pipe, that, you know, it is kind of being consumed by the chlorine, or sort of vice versa. So those are all things that, you know, are used in the treatment process. What we're trying to do is to move some of these things around. We're trying to treat some of the water a little sooner than before going through the filters, to give you know, each of the chemicals a little bit more residence time, to, you know, kind of to do its thing. I don't want to bore you with all the kind of chemical formulas and whatnot, but essentially there's a variety of steps that happen along the way, and what you're really trying to do is to space them out in a way that allows whatever chemical you're adding at a particular step to do its job. So those are more kind of, you know, tweaks of the existing treatment system that we have. The last thing we're talking about doing, and these are all things that, by the way, are all, we basically designed them, they're in review right now with DEP. These are things that would be built, you know, this coming year. The last thing we're talking about doing is putting aeration mixers into the 2 concrete storage tanks, again, to move the water around so that it doesn't stratify. One thing about water is, depending on what the temperature of the water is at different levels, the water will find its own level and stratify into different layers. And what you're trying to do is to circulate the water around so it's a little bit more homogeneous, so some of the water doesn't kind of hide its way in the tank. So these are all things that we're looking to have implemented. They're all what we call short-term recommendations. They're all things that have price tags that are all within the ability of our department financially to handle now. The rate structure is set up that we have adequate revenues available in our retained earnings. So again, it's part of the process. The whole idea of rates is supposed to be that, you know, you develop a rate, excuse me, a rate structure that funds the operation of the department. And right now, that's pretty much set up to do that. So we don't have to raise the rates in order to make these improvements. And we're hoping that, you know, the improvements together will have some noticeable results and kind of give us some idea of the benefit based upon, you know, sort of in relationship to the costs. I think we generally recognize that there's probably other things that will need to be done, but again, you know, looking at the responsibility that myself and the Board of Water Commissioners has, it's not just this idea that you need to fix the water quality and it doesn't matter what it costs. I mean, we want to make the water quality better and improve it, but there still has to be a balance there against the cost of doing it and being able to implement it in a way that's cost effective, that people can afford. Because in general, what it comes down to is the ratepayers that really fund all this. If you know anybody who lives in the MWRA system, their water quality is considered very good, but their bills are considered out of sight.
So's Raleigh's.
And you know what, I think you can say that about a lot of places, and that's sort of the balance that we have to find.
$4,000 for one guy.
It can get up there. It can get up there, and I think that's what we're trying to avoid here is to make the bills. We don't want to make the bills astronomical. I think in general the water bills have been reasonable. I know at my house it's the cheapest bill that shows up in my mailbox. So you know, I guess if you're putting that in perspective, it's still considered a bargain. And anybody who does any assessment in the water industry for rates always tries to point that out, that that's something to try to promote to the customers, that you're still delivering something for pennies. And in relationship to other services that get delivered to you, it's still the most bang for your buck. But still, you still wanna be financially responsible, and I think that's what we've done up to this point. Moving forward, you know, there's going to be some other needs. There's always maintaining the infrastructure. If a pipe is old, it needs to be replaced. If a tank is old, it needs to be replaced. If a well is clogged, it needs to be rehabilitated. There's always sort of more challenges and more, you know, maintenance and infrastructure needs that come along. So again, whatever improvements we make, you know, much of it now, the focus is on the water quality, but there's still an aspect of maintaining the infrastructure and maintaining the assets that you have. Because in the end, you still have to run the system complete. We're obligated to deliver safe and clean and abundant drinking water to the community. And I firmly believe that we do that. Aesthetically, there are some areas where the water gets delivered where it probably needs to be better. It doesn't show up at my house, so if I didn't work here, it wouldn't immediately be apparent to me that there was a problem. But now that I work for the water department, you know, we have, you know, areas where folks come in and they say, geez, my water is really discolored, or my water's really, it has a funny smell, or it stains my laundry. And these are things that, you know, that we know, you know, are a problem. A lot of the areas are in the far ends of the system. They're sort of dead ends, where there's a significantly long travel time, you know, to get the water from where it's comes out of the ground and treated and stored to where it winds up, you know, being delivered. And so, you know, in some of those areas, perhaps one of the things that needs to be looked at is looping the water mains, connecting dead ends so that it makes sort of a circle. Those are things right now that seem to need a lot more planning, because they probably are gonna require things like easements, because they're going either between people's properties or, you know, through wooded areas or wetland areas. It's not something that you just, you know, show up with a load of pipe and an excavator and start working. I mean, you could, but it's not, you know, it's not like the water system when it was developed in the 30s. There's planning and engineering and permitting to go with these things, and land acquisition and cost assessments, and it can be a kind of a daunting task. We have a water system that sort of sits out in an area where we're not really connected to the next towns. I mean, we have emergency connections, but the irony there is that our what's called hydraulic grade line, the energy level in our water, based upon elevation and pressures, is greater than the areas around us. So we can deliver water to folks by turning a valve. We need to apply pumps to pump the water back from those areas to us, because our hydraulic grade line and our energy levels in the water are higher. So there's no magic solution by just getting water from Raleigh or Groveland or Byfield, you know, the next town over. It's certainly more of a challenge.
Aren't there a few houses we're pumping water to over in Bloxford?
I'm sorry?
Aren't there a couple of 3 houses that we're giving water to over in Bloxford on Nelson Street?
I believe there's a
Or
few
Georgetown
instances. I believe there's a few instances where we have customers that reside in other communities. You know, again, because I'm new here, I'm not sure of how that transpired. I mean, I think in general, there's only a very limited amount where that could happen. Whether it's appropriate for that to happen or not, I mean, somebody had made that decision a long time ago, and it's probably well down on our priority list in terms of cleaning that kind of stuff up. If they're a customer and they're paying, I think
Is the Marshall well up and running?
yes, yes it is. Marshall, in fact, the Marshall well, we just had the motor rehabilitated and a new shaft put into the well, as part of a rehabilitation effort. We had like I think we spun a bearing in the motor and had to send that out to a shop. So, yes.
When did they stop using coke for a filter?
Charcoal.
No, coke.
Coke?
There was a place up there, I don't know which well it was, there was 14 ton of coke, and the water would come in out of the ground and filter through that.
Yeah,
to get the iron out.
I'm gonna say that's gotta probably go back to the sixties.
Yeah, definitely does.
You know, I don't, I mean, water and wastewater treatment, it's what I actually went to college for. And those are technologies that they don't actively teach now, so it's more of a historical thing. But in the evolution of it, it was probably a great idea, because what was done before that,
So I got the job of taking that coke out.
Yeah.
If I could have the coke if I could get it out.
Yeah.
In 2 weeks.
yeah, I actually had a job where I had to work with guys to take media out of filters down in the town of Cohasset. Same idea, and changing out filter media after it's been in use for 40 years. It's kind of it's not any, yeah. You have to create an interesting process to pull that out with vacuums and.
I have
It's
a
interesting.
general question
Sure.
here. Years ago, back in the '60s,
Yeah.
I lived on North Street at that time. There was an odor or taste situation where it was very obvious. Doesn't seem to be the case now. I think over the years that's subsided quite a bit. But when you do have something like that, if it's an odor, does it tend to be from the minerals that are being sucked up in the area where the water is, or is it in the chemicals that?
Yeah, I
they
mean,
use
I
to-
think you'd have to,
purify it?
I'd have to know more about the particular odor. I mean, generally, we have groundwater supplies, so things that create odor problems for groundwater, I mean, it depends. If it's sort of a rotten egg smell, the sulfur and sulfates naturally occur in the ground. So you can get a little of that. If we're dosing excessively in chlorine, like for instance, when I talked to one of the guys about the flushing on North Street, he said there's definitely more evidence of a chlorine residual on North Street from our flushing than say there was on Tenney Street. Now, if you look at the map, you say, well, Tenney Street's further away than North Street from where we apply chlorine. So while there's still chlorine residual out at Tenney Street, it's a little bit lower. And again, it's part of the, it's like walking across the desert. You have to have enough food and water to get to the other side. And that's really a big challenge for us, because we don't have, snack shacks along the way, nor do we have chemical addition points along the way. So we have to create a methodology in the treatment that allows, adequate water quality throughout the entire system. That means there may be some variability along the way. So if it's a chlorine smell, you might get it more, say, on North Street than, say, on Tenney Street or, Jackman Street further out into the system. If you had, kind of a pondy smell, sometimes that's a lack of chlorine, or too low of a residual. There's kind of a variety of things. And that's one of the things too that we're trying to focus on more, is responding to complaints, not just to run out and open a hydrant to let people think we're doing something, but to actually gather real information about what's going on, and trying to compile that in a way that will help us answer questions, in terms of trying to make the system better. Yes?
You said you draw the water from wells.
Yes.
Are the wells connected to an aquifer?
There's the Parker River, in the areas adjacent to the Parker River, there's essentially gravel layers that hold the water. That's the aquifer for that basin. The wells that we have are all in the 40 to 60 foot deep range. So they're all essentially drawing water from the same place. And that's basically the aquifer that recharges the river. you know, we're kind of getting it from below, not from the river itself. If it was from the river itself, it would be a surface water. You need an entirely different treatment scheme for that. It's kind of like what North Andover does out of Lake Kachikowik. That's a surface water supply, so they use unit processes for water treatment specifically designed for what's in surface water.
So the various ponds and lakes in the area, they're not part of the water system?
No, you know, the hydrologic cycle that exists on Earth is, you know, it rains, it hits the ground, it runs off, it finds low-lying areas, it finds freshwater rivers, it makes its way to the ocean, it evaporates, it comes back around. There's a whole cycle that works there. So to say the water in a pond doesn't somehow magically wind up in the well, I mean, you'd have to find a way to trace that. I mean, it's all part of, you know, it's like trying to figure out what your area of influence is. You know, if the boundary is just the watershed that surface flows into the river, into the basin there, you could say it's not in that basin. If water was somehow to move one way or the other, you know, right along the boundaries, yeah, you could probably pull it in. But to say that it's immediately from the surface water, the wells are set up to not be drawing water influenced by the surface water. Yes?
One last question. I'm on Pond Street opposite the glass hydrant, and the water coming in for the toilets and so forth, all is brown.
Pond Street? Hold on.
Pond Street. I have to use iron out to
Okay.
get rid of that from the toilets.
So are you beyond Prescott Street?
Yes, just on the other side.
On
Okay.
the other side is
So you
all-
just passed Prescott,
Yeah.
That's
where
right.
Spalding comes in, okay.
Yeah.
So you're basically, you're at one of the far ends of the system,
Yeah,
that's like right here,
yeah.
Okay?
okay. So what was your question, I'm sorry?
So we have to use iron out
Yeah.
in the toilets to get the rust out,
Yes,
and the wash is something else again.
yeah.
Ooh, comes out terrible.
Again, because you're in an area, I mean, you're on a dead end, basically at the town line. When I was talking about looping, if there was a way to loop the water main through the woods in, I guess, a northeasterly fashion along the town border to pick up the water main at the end of Thurlow Street, then that water would do this.
Well, there is a loop. You got Pond Street, but then you got Prescott, Pillsbury,
Yeah.
and it can get rooted down Pillsbury to that same hydrant.
You know, that the thing is that's so far away from the system.
Yeah.
It's a miniature loop
Yeah.
that really doesn't do anything for you guys. It probably doesn't even do anything for people on Pillsbury. The loop that would need to be made is along there. Now, you know, again, we're trying to make some bigger improvements, and that's probably gonna be part of a strategy out into the future. If I had to guess, I would say that's, you know, if we're trying to make a look ahead here, that might be a 10-year out type of thing. But in the history of the water system, you know, that would be relatively new. You know, again, the look ahead for the things that we have here, go out to, as far out as 2020. So, you know, these are all, even though they're considered longer term, some of the longer term discussions in here are how to pay for them. And the payment for those things, some of them go out to 2040. You know what I mean? Because they're multi-million-dollar projects.
I won't be there.
The only other thing I wanted to touch base, because I'm realizing that this may actually be on TV. I actually brought some water meters, because one of the things that we're looking at right now is the replacement of some of our meters, and also continuing to convert the reading devices in the out in the system from touchpad or plug-in style reading, where somebody has to physically walk up to the house to interrogate the meter from outside, to actually having a radio signal. Probably about 1,200 houses in town have little radio boxes on the outside that are wired into the meter. That started about maybe 8 years ago. It hasn't moved as fast as I would have liked to have seen it, but that was kind of the approach up to now. We're taking a little bit more of an aggressive approach. Fortunately, the technology has changed a little bit too, and the newer water meters now actually have a radio unit built onto the meter. So we can kind of go into the house now, and in 15 minutes, take that guy out and put this one in. And now we don't need to put a radio on the outside of your house, and in 15 minutes, we're in and out. We have a new water meter in here, the body of it, so mechanically the device is the way it's supposed to be. And then in terms of the cost effectiveness of reading meters, which is something that we're always trying to improve, we actually have the radio units now, so that means there'll be less and less need to walk up to houses. We're kind of working our way through the areas. The next area we want to work on is Andover Street, because if you're trying to read meters in Andover Street in the winter, there's really no place to pull the car over, and it's not exactly the easiest place to walk up and down. Historically, there's been a lot of estimating of readings, maybe because of my engineering background, but guessing at numbers is not something that is intuitive to me, especially when you can get a real answer. And so my philosophy now is we're not going to be guessing at numbers anymore. We're going to get real numbers, and we're going to find cost-effective ways to get real numbers quicker and less expensive. And that's obviously part of what we're supposed to be doing since we're running a public utility. Okay. Okay. I'll leave you with the last one is that that's the inside of what a meter looks like, and basically it's a simple mechanical device. Water moves through and it turns a disc, and the disc turns the numbers on a dial. It's about as simple a machine. The technology there is probably 100 years old. It's just been improved and made easier to operate. So, that's something you might hear more of is people contacting you to swap out meters and that kind of thing.
Something that they can participate hearing and that, if they've got more questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the office.
Yeah, my office is always open. I'd love to have anybody stop by if they have a few minutes. We'd make some time or whatever. We could answer more questions. Getting the public involved and understanding the water system, I think, is something we really want to work on more. So,